Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 essential, you can't live without them, orchestral serenades for beginners. Now, what is the difference between a serenade and another orchestral thing, like a symphony? Well, as a serenade suggests, the word sort of means something relaxed, something mellow, something given to somebody else, like you serenade your girlfriend under her balcony. You do something like that kind of thing. It's relaxed music making to enchant and delight. And that's what these pieces are. And how do you get more enchanting and relaxing? Because, symphonies are not exactly short on the enchantment part. Some of them aren't always that relaxed, but they're usually enchanting and delightful. Well, what you do is you loosen the form. And we talk about that often. We have looser forms and tighter forms, forms that require more intellectual engagement, and forms that are a little bit freer and you don't have to work so hard when you listen to them. The point is not following development of things. And serenades are that kind of thing. And the way that we loosen the form in a serenade most of the time is just by adding extra movements. And those movements are usually dance movements. Something in a simple ABA shape that has a catchy tune and a simple rhythm. And the result of that is that the piece gets bigger and longer on the one hand, but also more diverse and more and more sort of randomish. There's less of a fixed sense of progress from point to point and an organic unity keeping them all together. The point here is diversity. It's diversity and you can go and have a snack in the middle of it, and it's okay. You're not going to miss anything. Sometimes in a big serenade, you could add solos, as in a concerto. In fact, you can stick an entire concerto. 3 movements can feature a solo instrument, a violin or a something. There's all kinds of stuff that you can put into a serenade. It's a potpourri, in a sense. And serenades are not necessarily written for orchestra. There are serenades for wind ensembles, for string quartets, for any type of instrument, string trios. You name it. The idea here is the large size and relaxed overall ambience. And with that, you have a serenade. It's a loose definition. Just as the form is loose, you can call almost anything you want a serenade in that sense. And they're just lovely pieces. They're wonderful, and just because they're so enjoyable and relaxing and unpretentious, they're wonderful as introductions to orchestral music, to composers who might have written other things in a more overtly intellectual style. They're composers relaxing, and we should too. So here are 10 fabulous serenades. Most of them will have more than 4 movements, as a typical symphony has. They'll have 5 or 6 or something. Not always, but most of the time. But that relaxed feeling, that feeling of simple pleasure and joy and melody and dancing, and that's what they're all going to have in common. So, the king of serenade writing, the absolute king, was Mozart. Mozart wrote serenades for orchestra, big ones, lots of them. His most famous one is Eine kleine Nachtmusik for strings, and serenades for winds. His grand partita is the big wind serenade in the history of the universe. Mozart was forced to write these things because he was living in Salzburg, and he was, an employee of the court, and he was asked, they were very popular in Salzburg, he was asked to write serenades for all kinds of special occasions. And he did. And some of them are, rather perfunctory, but most of them are marvelous. He really got into it. He enjoyed it much more than he enjoyed writing masses and sacred music. So his 2 greatest orchestral serenades are in this list. First is the Haffner Serenade, which was written for the Haffners, a wedding of, I think her name was Elizabeth Haffner or something like that. It was written for that. And it's a big multi-movement extravaganza with solos and all kinds of stuff happening. And then the Posthorn Serenade, which has a posthorn solo. Posthorn was, it's like a trumpet, and it announced the fact that the mail was on its way. It was when the post showed up. It's a little horseback thing, You were delivering the mail. So those are the two big Mozart serenades, and I've listed them pretty comprehensively so that you can know what they are. Do not confuse the Haffner Serenade with the Haffner Symphony. It's a completely different work. Totally different work. The Haffners were busy people. He wrote a bunch of things for the Haffners. So you've got a serenade, and you've got a symphony, and you've got the Posthorn Serenade. The symphony, by the way, is his number 35. Totally different work. And very popular. So it's the one that goes, this is the Haffner, the Haffner. You can hum it. Anyway, so that's Mozart. Next, Brahms wrote two serenades. And Brahms wrote serenades because he was afraid to write symphonies until much later in his career. Remember, his first symphony didn't appear till he was 50, and after 20 years of work and keeping it in his pocket and being afraid to release it. But in the meantime, he was trying to learn how to write for the orchestra and what to do with an orchestra. And he wrote a couple concertos, and he wrote his two serenades. They are rather neglected in the world of Brahms orchestral music, which is really kind of bizarre because Brahms only wrote a dozen orchestral pieces. There's not a lot. And they're beautiful. The first serenade is gorgeous. Oh my God, it's full of sunshine and brightness, and it has 6 movements and 2 little scherzos, it's just beautiful. A lovely work. Orchestrally, it's very colorful. It's more free in its sense of exploitation of woodwind sonority and whatnot than the symphonies are. Because Brahms' symphonic style is much more austere and sober. And his second serenade is for a small orchestra with no violins, which throws all of the work onto the woodwind section. Woodwinds are really important in serenades, in producing that wonderful open-air sound, because serenades were first and foremost outdoors music. If you're serenading your beloved under a balcony, chances are you're outside and they're inside. So the music has to carry through the night air, and woodwinds are much better at that than stringed instruments are. And so even if the serenade is not for winds, we've done a whole thing on serenades for strings. There are serenades for strings. Those are indoor pieces. Woodwinds are more outdoorsy, more bucolic, So we listen to these orchestral serenades with particular attention being paid to what's happening in the woodwind section. So after Brahms, you have Robert Fuchs. Now, Robert Fuchs was known as Mr. Serenade. He was a composer and pedagogue at the end of the 19th century, and he taught everybody. He taught Sibelius, he taught Mahler, he taught the whole 1850s and 60s generation of composers who were educated in Vienna. They took classes with Robert Fuchs. As a composer, he was quite conservative, and he wrote 5 serenades that are delicious, and I've done a video about some of them, so please go have a look if you want. The music is charming, and just everything a serenade should be, with that wonderful Viennese Gemütlichkeit, that relaxation, that sense of fulfillment, of happiness and freshness. It's just marvelous. And if you like Robert Fuchs, you're going to like everything else on this list, but there's so much more fun. Alfredo Casella. Now, Casella wrote a serenata, which is just Italian for serenade. Serenade. So, there are lots of words for serenade, and they're all the same. There's serenade, there's cassation, there's partita, you could call these things a million different things. But serenade, serenata is the most popular. His Serenade for Chamber Orchestra is another fresh and delightful, sparkly, somewhat neoclassical kind of piece. A lot of more modern serenades are avowedly neoclassical. That is, they're composers looking back at the days of aristocratic serenading and stuff like that, especially in Spain with guitar, you're serenading under the balcony in the moonlight, like you have in Don Giovanni, Mozart's Don Giovanni. So yeah, there you go. So there's the Casella Serenata. Then there's Walter Piston, the American composer, who also wrote a serenata, because he was really Italian, actually. He's changed his name to Piston. and from something like Pistoni or something like that. But he was Italian in upbringing and a New Englander. So when you put those two things together, the Italian New Englander from like Maine or wherever he was from, or Boston or somewhere like that, New England, you get a lovely little serenata for orchestra. And unlike the Mozart serenades or the Brahms even, which are big, these modern serenades tend to be quite perky and petite. They are short and concise. They're smaller than a symphony, not in the number of movements, but in their length, in making them charming and brief, brevity being the soul of serenaditude in the modern world. Another wonderful example of that is the Korngold Baby Serenade. Now, the Baby Serenade, oh, this is delicious. Oh, it's a wonderful piece. It was written for the birth of his son, George, who became a record producer and produced a lot of his dad's music and a lot of wonderful records of film music, George Korngold. And the Baby Serenade is noteworthy for being wonderfully, wonderfully scored for, popular instruments, including a bunch of saxophones. You've got a couple of saxophones. The tunes are just gushing. It's got saxophones and harps and glittery percussion, and it's just beautiful. I don't know why it's not better known. Probably because of those saxophones. That makes it a little bit awkward to play in normal symphony concerts, but oh my goodness, it's just marvelous. Marvelous piece. And the movements have programmatic titles. Baby enters the world, and he's born, and it's great. It's great. Totally different kind of serenade. Bernstein's Serenade after Plato's Symposium. This is really a violin concerto. It's for violin, strings, and percussion, as all of Bernstein's concerto works are for strings and percussion in some kind, with a harp often. And it's a serenade because it has extra movements. It's a serenade in the old sense. That is, it has more than the normal 3 movements of a concerto. It's also very much a dialogue, a discussion between the violin and the orchestra, and as Plato's Symposium was. And the serenade aspect is the extra movements and the sense of conversation and relaxed conversation. But of course, this being Bernstein, it's kind of a dramatic piece. It has some very tragic music, some very emotionally expressive music. Great, it's great fun, and wonderfully, wonderfully written for violin and orchestra. It's one of the great violin concertos of the 20th century, no question about that. And the term serenade is quite deliberate on Bernstein's part, because he's trying to evoke that sense of conviviality, of friends getting together and sort of having a party, having a discussion. And that's what the music does. So it's a serenade in a different sense. However, the greatest of all the modern orchestral serenades, 20th century orchestral serenades, is by the Swedish composer Wilhelm Stenhammar. Now, his serenade, it also has some extra movements. It's a big work. It's about 45 minutes long. There's a little extra movement called like reverenza that may or may not show up because he took it out and threw another one in there instead. It's a brilliant work. It's his orchestral masterpiece. It really is. And it's a work of genius. It is wonderfully melodic and richly colored and expressive, and it somehow has its cake and eats it too. In other words, it gives you that sense of ease and fun and freedom of a serenade, but it's also a very tightly knit piece. And it's, in a way, somehow it really gives a sense of having substance. It's got meat on its bones. It's the composer writing it with the fullest extent of his musical powers. And Stenhammar did not write a lot of orchestral music either. There are some overtures, a couple concertos, 2 symphonies, one of which is a masterpiece, number 2. But this serenade is absolutely one of the great works in the form. It's Stenhammar's orchestral masterpiece, as I said, and it's just essential listening. If you're a serenadist, you're definitely going to want to hear this piece. And with that, we have 10 essential, marvelous orchestral serenades for you to listen to and just relax and enjoy and knit and whatever else you feel like doing. Jigsaw puzzles, it's great music. Great music, there's great music for every purpose. And there's even great music to relax to. And this is that, unquestionably. Something wonderful to set your mind at ease and make your life happier. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me, and take care.